Hey y'all. Before we get into the substance of today's episode, I want to take a moment to advise some listener discretion. This episode is about abortion and maternal health care in America. If that's not something you want to hear, then I do get it. It's a tough subject, but this is a tough time in America, and it's something that I need to talk about in this moment. You may disagree, and that's fine. Maybe sit this one out if that's the case. At the same time, if you're one of those people who thinks that true crime and politics should never ever intersect, I really do hope that you rethink that. As I've covered before on this podcast, crime is, in and of itself, political. The people who make laws are politicians, and those laws are then enforced by, you guessed it, law enforcement. True crime as a genre is a good way to share spooky stories and highlight the worst of humanity, and I think this episode is a prime example of the latter. But don't get it twisted. True crime is by no means escapism. If you look to true crime to escape your world for a second, a minute, or even an hour, please do not lose sight of the fact that every true crime story is a recounting of real events that happened to real people. It is not escapism in any way. This episode is no different, and will feature a not-so-subtle political message. So with all that being said, listener discretion is advised. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court decided one of its landmark cases, Roe v. Wade. In it, the court established a woman's constitutional right to choose to have an abortion. The case arose after a woman named Norma McCorvey, under the pseudonym Jane Roe, challenged abortion laws in the state of Texas, which had criminalized the procedure except in life-saving circumstances. The case went all the way through the court system up to the Supreme Court, which ruled 7-2 in McCorvey, or Roe's, favor in 1973. This ruling declared the Texas law outlawing abortion illegal, claiming it violated the right to privacy for U.S. citizens, protected under the 14th Amendment. But afterward, this ruling set up a precarious legal framework, which allowed abortions throughout the United States under certain guidelines. But this framework was never enshrined into law, becoming something that many of us began to take for granted as an assurance, with those of us that believed in a woman's right to choose just hoping that the Supreme Court would not overrule itself, citing its prior adherence to precedent to keep the Roe v. Wade decision as a mandate. Sadly, that was not the case.
We're following some major breaking news down in the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade. The ruling ends nearly 50 years of constitutional protections for abortions. Bans are expected in roughly half of America's states. It comes more than a month after the stunning leak of a draft opinion by Justice Samuel Alito indicating the court was prepared to take this momentous step.
In 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled its decision from nearly half a century prior, deciding to take on a lawsuit from the state of Mississippi which was challenging Roe v. Wade because of a state law they had put into place, outlawing abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 ruling, overturned Roe v. Wade, agreeing with Mississippi that it could put its own law into effect, criminalizing abortions after 15 weeks. This ruling also allowed each state to begin implementing their own abortion policies, ensuring that there would be no uniform standard between all 50 American states. This also ensured that many states would begin to enact much more restrictive laws than Mississippi, especially the deeper red states, which had already made it clear that they planned to enact sweeping abortion bans. In the time since this decision was announced just 2 years ago, several states have followed through with their stated plans. This includes states where abortion is almost entirely banned, such as Alabama, Arkansas, Idaho, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and West Virginia. Some, such as Texas and Idaho, have even tried to criminalize crossing state lines to seek an abortion, something that violates so many constitutional rights and interstate commerce laws that I don't know where to begin. Others, like Indiana, North Dakota, and Georgia, have enacted abortion bans after 6 weeks of pregnancy, a time period in which many girls and women don't even realize they're pregnant. It is in the last of these states that I mentioned, Georgia, that today's episode takes place, and puts our focus where it should be, on a woman's right to choose. This is the story of Amber Thurman. Amber Nicole Thurman, born on September 16, 1993, grew up in Georgia, where she would live for her entire life. By 2022, Amber was the mother of a 6-year-old son who she raised as a single parent. She worked as a medical assistant, but had plans to attend nursing school so that she could continue to take care of people professionally. At the time this story unfolds, she had just recently moved out of her family's home into her own apartment, which was in a gated complex that had a pool, according to some reporting by ProPublica, who are the primary source for today's episode. At the time, Amber also had a boyfriend. In the summer of 2022, 28-year-old Amber Thurman seemed to have some real momentum in her life. Things were looking up, and she had a plan for how the next several years were going to play out. So when she discovered she was pregnant, with twins no less, those plans suddenly looked precarious. Having 2 children at once is incredibly tough, not just physically, having to carry twins to term, but emotionally and mentally. I struggled enough dropping my own career to help take care of my daughter, and with another child on the way, I'm equally terrified. I can't imagine the prospect of twins while raising another child as a single parent. So early in the pregnancy, Amber decided to terminate it before it was too far along, a choice that was hers and hers alone to make. As reported by ProPublica, Amber wanted to have this abortion done in Georgia so that she could remain close to home and receive any necessary aftercare if necessary. But at the time, with Roe v. Wade having just been recently overturned, she wasn't sure if that was a realistic possibility. In 2019, back when Roe v. Wade was still the law of the land, Georgia's governor, Brian Kemp, had signed a bill into law. This bill had been part of a nationwide attempt by Republican lawmakers to impose tough abortion restrictions throughout their states, all of them equally hoping that their bill would be the one to get challenged up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where then-President Donald Trump had recently appointed 2 new judges, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, who replaced Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy in 2017 and 18 respectively. A third Trump appointee to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett, would replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2020, giving the conservative-appointed judges on the court a 6-3 majority, and giving Republican politicians the belief that if an abortion-related case came across their desk, they would overturn Roe v. Wade and send abortion back to the states, where it could then be banned. So back in 2019, Georgia Governor Brian Kemp had signed his own version of the bill into law, calling it the Living Infants Fairness and Equality Act, or the LIFE Act, undoubtedly a name that they pigeonholed into an acronym. This act would ban all abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy, with 6 weeks being the first time that fetal cardiac activity could be detected, give or take. Hence the popular framing of this by conservatives as a heartbeat bill. As I mentioned, this took place back in 2019, when Roe v. Wade was still in effect, making Governor Brian Kemp just one of several Republican politicians who chose to virtue signal how pro-life he was by signing legislation that he knew would not be enacted for months, maybe even years.
Governor Kemp, thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Governor Kemp called it a law that makes a declaration.
A declaration that all life has value, that all life matters, and that all life is worthy of protection.
And it's part of a nationwide effort. Georgia is one of 6 states that have passed heartbeat bills. Courts have already struck down 2 of them. Lawsuits are pending in 3 more. Meantime, 7 more state legislatures are considering heartbeat bills, and Alabama is pondering the toughest one, criminalizing abortion at any stage.
I think the people of Georgia, once the shrill attacks of the opponents sort of fade in the background, I think the common sense of Georgians will kick in and recognize that the House Bill 41 is a common sense measure that we can all be proud of.
HB 481 is based on medically inaccurate information.
Opponents of the bill lobbied unsuccessfully for weeks to quash the heartbeat bill. They say it will drive obstetricians and gynecologists out of Georgia, even those who merely talk to patients about abortion options.
So it really, for all intents and purposes, is an abortion ban. And it furthermore criminalizes the act of providing abortion. So you're creating liabilities for doctors that's just sometimes too hard for them to face.
A lot of OBGYNs and a lot of doctors are wanting to leave now. And they have already told us if this bill is signed and they will leave.
Backers of the law acknowledge that physicians lobbied against it, but they don't expect an exodus of OBGYNs.
I cannot tell you how many OBGYNs have come to me and said, thank you for this.
Opponents of the bill are pretty confident that they can at least stall the heartbeat law in court. They also acknowledge that the U.S. Supreme Court is more friendly to pro-life bills like this one than it has been in nearly 50 years, Cheryl.
Following the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade in 2022, Georgia's 6-week abortion ban went into effect almost immediately. It was first challenged in court, but a federal appeals court overruled an injunction against it on July 20th, 2022, allowing it to go into immediate effect. As part of this law, if any doctors were found to have violated it, they would lose their ability to practice medicine and could face up to a decade in prison. This came just weeks before Amber Thurman made a very difficult choice. After discovering that she was pregnant, Amber Thurman had decided that she wanted to terminate her pregnancy, but she wanted to have the procedure done in Georgia, close to home, just in case she experienced any difficulties. Mostly, she wanted to be around for her son. At the same time, Georgia's government was in the midst of determining whether or not it could fully outlaw abortion, which it did, at around the same time Amber had come to this decision. After waiting as long as possible, she realized that she couldn't anymore. In her 9th week of pregnancy, in August of 2022, Amber Thurman traveled out of state to North Carolina, where abortion was still legal. There, she had made an appointment to have the surgical procedure done, but traffic prevented her from getting there on time. As a result, her scheduled appointment could not be held, because an influx of women from out of state had similarly been traveling to North Carolina to get the procedure done themselves. Despite missing her appointment, Amber was told that she could have a medication abortion. It was riskier but easier, and would allow her to terminate the pregnancy now, while it was still earlier, as opposed to having to reschedule and try again later, after the fetus had grown some more. So at the clinic, she received the abortion pill mifepristone, and was given a second pill to take a day later, misoprostol. She took that pill as instructed. The symptoms started a day later, in the form of cramps. Amber had been expecting those and assumed it was normal. But in the days that followed, the cramps became worse and worse, and she began to experience an excessive amount of bleeding. On the evening of August 18th, 2022, the symptoms progressed. Amber began vomiting blood and then passed out at home, causing her boyfriend to call 911 and request an ambulance. Amber arrived at the Piedmont Henry Hospital in Stockbridge, Georgia a short time later and was admitted at 6:51 p.m. Doctors quickly diagnosed her with an infection, which was beginning to worsen into sepsis, a full-body infection where white blood cells begin multiplying rapidly and blood pressure drops to a dangerous level. As reported by ProPublica, doctors noted that Amber's stomach was tender to the touch, and when she got up to use the bathroom, she fainted yet again, hitting her head in the process. Doctors also noted a foul odor during a pelvic exam. After telling doctors that she had recently received a chemical abortion, they determined that she needed a procedure known as a dilation and curettage, also known as a D&C. This procedure would remove the remaining fetal tissue in her body, helping get rid of the rapidly deteriorating infection that was now threatening her life. It turns out that after going through the medication abortion, Amber's body had ejected most of the fetal tissue, but not all of it. An ultrasound confirmed that there was still some additional tissue in her uterus, which was causing her to now go into septic shock. While doctors and nurses knew that Amber needed a D&C performed, Georgia's abortion law prevented them from taking place except in cases where the mother's life was in imminent danger. At the time, that wasn't happening yet, but it would as the infection worsened and hours began to pass. Doctors had diagnosed Amber Thurman with sepsis as early as 9:38 p.m. on August 18th, but would wait before performing the D&C, knowing that she had recently had a chemical abortion. They worried that if they performed the D&C, then they too would have been taking part in an abortion and could be prosecuted as a result. So they started Amber on antibiotics and refrained from removing any fetal tissue in her uterus. Early the following morning, August 19th, Amber was diagnosed with acute severe sepsis, and at 5:14 a.m. was reported to be breathing rapidly and experiencing heavy blood loss. At 6:45 she was taken into intensive care, and at 7:14, as reported by ProPublica, doctors again discussed initiating a D&C to get rid of the fetal tissue and hopefully stop the infection. But no D&C was performed, and roughly 2 hours later, Amber's internal organs began to fail. Roughly 20 hours after arriving at the hospital, at 2 p.m. on August 19th, the D&C was finally performed on Amber Thurman. But at that point, her organs had already gone into failure, and she died on the operating table, her heart finally giving in during surgery. Her death certificate would list septic shock and retained products of conception as her cause of death, the latter of which was so rare that it had not been cited in Georgia's death records in over a decade, due in no small part to modern medicine and the ability for women to easily seek out medical care due to complications that arose during or after pregnancy, something that was no longer guaranteed. More after the break. Amber Thurman was one of the first documented cases of abortion-related deaths in America following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade in 2022, a ruling that had a direct impact on Amber Thurman's life and certainly led to her death. That ruling, which came about due to the conservative majority on the court, allowed Georgia's pre-existing Life Act from 2019 to go into effect, making it so Amber had to seek abortion care out of state. Then, when complications arose, she went to a hospital near her home in Georgia, but was not able to receive the necessary care because she had already gone through an abortion. Instead, she was left to suffer from a debilitating infection for nearly an entire day after being admitted, a time period of roughly 20 hours, and unnecessarily died as a result. She left behind her friends and family, including her 6-year-old son, who now has to wade through life without his biggest advocate, his mother. Amber Thurman's death, which flew under the radar in 2022, has become a pretty major news story in the US because of ProPublica's reporting on it in recent months. And as a result, it's brought into focus the so-called heartbeat bills, which have been passed by Republican politicians in an effort to save quote-unquote babies, even though fetuses at 6 weeks of development in no way look like a baby. But that's really beside the point. In no uncertain terms, Georgia's heartbeat bill led to Amber's death. And it's not like this is something the state's politicians had not considered or heard of. Back in 2019, during one of the public hearings concerning Georgia's abortion bill, Dr. Melissa Kotke had warned lawmakers that doctors would refrain from giving patients potentially life-saving care because they would be concerned about prosecution, telling them they would feel the need to wait for higher blood pressure, wait for a higher fever, really got to justify this one, bleed a little bit more. And in this specific case, that's exactly what happened. Instead of immediately giving Amber Thurman a D&C to stop the infection that ultimately killed her, doctors waffled and waited for the condition to become critical, acting when it was already too late. A conservative publication, the Washington Examiner, would attempt to muddy the waters around Amber's death, claiming that it was the abortion pills themselves that had killed Amber Thurman. But in their shoddy article, published on September 20th, 2024, they instead blamed confusion of the state's anti-abortion law rather than the law itself for Amber's death, which seems like a weird way of trying to split a hair that doesn't need splitting. It doesn't matter if doctors chose not to save Amber Thurman's life because of the law itself or their potential interpretations of the horribly written and vague law. The end result was the exact same fucking thing. The medical team and officials responsible for the decision not to immediately perform the D&C on Amber Thurman have not gone on the record, but her story has been shared by multiple publications, including ProPublica, whose award-worthy piece was published just months ago. In the time since, the story has become a subject of debate between presidential candidates, and the article itself explores how Georgia's own Maternal Mortality Review Committee concluded that there was a good chance that Amber's death could have been prevented if doctors had simply performed the D&C sooner. It also highlighted how difficult to interpret many of these restrictive state abortion bans are, based entirely on how they're written. The following passage is taken directly from the ProPublica piece, which I'll link to you in the show notes and would encourage you all check out, but it centers primarily on the Georgia state law outlawing abortion. It prohibits doctors from using any instrument with the purpose of terminating a pregnancy. While removing fetal tissue is not terminating a pregnancy medically speaking, the law only specifies it's not considered an abortion to remove a dead unborn child that resulted from spontaneous abortion, defined as naturally occurring from a miscarriage or a stillbirth. Thurman had told doctors her miscarriage was not spontaneous. It was the result of taking pills to terminate her pregnancy. There is also an exception, included in most bans, to allow abortions necessary in order to prevent the death of the pregnant woman or the substantial and irreversible physical impairment of a major bodily function. There is no standard protocol for how providers should interpret such language, doctors said. How can they be sure a jury with no medical experience would agree that intervening was necessary? ProPublica asked the governor's office on Friday to respond to cases of denied care and where its exceptions were adequate. Spokesperson Garrison Douglas said they were clear and gave doctors the power to act in medical emergencies. He returned to the state's previous argument, describing ProPublica's reporting as a fear-mongering campaign. Republican officials across the country have largely rejected calls to provide guidance. When legislators have tried, anti-abortion groups have blocked them.
ProPublica found at least 2 women in Georgia who died after being unable to get either a legal abortion or timely medical care. Official state committees examining pregnancy-related deaths concluded that both were preventable. Georgia law says a physician can go to prison for performing an abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy. The law does have an exception to prevent the death of a pregnant woman, but physicians say there's no guidance on how to interpret that. Kavitha Sarana is the ProPublica journalist who reported this story. Kavitha, your stories illustrate 2 aspects of this Georgia law. The first case involving Amber Nicole Thurman. She tried to get an abortion out of state, missed her appointment for a traffic jam, of all things, and so was prescribed a medication abortion. What happened to her?
Right, and it's important to make clear that abortion medication, major medical organizations and studies have consistently found that they are safe and effective when taken appropriately, but they can cause complications. And if complications happen, patients should go to the hospital right away and expect to receive a DNC procedure. That's the same kind of procedure that's used for both abortions and miscarriage care to remove any fetal tissue that remains. So what we know is that Amber had complications. She went to the hospital and doctors waited 20 hours to provide a DNC. They talked about it multiple times. They monitored her as her blood pressure fell, her organs began failing, and ultimately when they did intervene, it was too late to save her life. The Maternal Mortality Review Committee reviewed this case, and they agreed that it was preventable, and they said that the largest impact was the delay in receiving a DNC procedure. They said that there was a good chance if doctors had done it sooner that her life could have been saved.
Why did the doctors delay?
We don't know what was going through the doctors' heads, and the hospitals did not respond to requests for comment. A lot of lawmakers that have passed these abortion bans, and not just Georgia's, have promised that they have exceptions for the life of the mother or medical emergencies, but they're written in ways that experts say are confusing and not rooted in science. They threaten prison time if a prosecutor decides that they're not followed correctly, and doctors have told me that this type of threat, it can really change the dynamics of how they interact with patients. In fact, we've reported a lot of in-depth stories about this kind of delay in care where doctors have explained exactly how it changed the way that they were treating patients. Even if they do feel like they can go ahead, sometimes they also have to convince lawyers and nurses and other colleagues to participate who have the right in some states like Georgia not to participate in any abortion-related care.
Try as they might to distance themselves from Amber Thurman's death, the politicians that enacted the restrictive and ironically named Life Act back in 2019 are directly responsible for Amber's death in 2022. And sadly, they're not the only ones with blood on their hands. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, similar bills were passed all over the United States, almost entirely in red states, governed by GOP politicians who have ran on restricting abortion for decades. Making this not a matter of opinion by me or anyone else, rather, but a stated objective of the Republican Party and its evangelical donors for longer than I've been alive. Texas, my new home, has begun to enforce new and old bans, including laws that predate the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, as well as more recent laws. This includes a new law passed in August of 2022, which banned almost all abortions. The exception lies in the vague terminology of whenever the mother's life is in danger, but as this episode has shown, there's no clear terminology to define where that is. Is it when the infection begins? Or is it when the mother begins to experience organ failure? And even then, if it is determined that the mother's life was not in adequate danger, the doctor that performed the procedure could risk up to 99 years in prison for performing what politicians would determine was an illegal abortion. Texas also made headlines when, in 2021, they passed a law empowering private citizens to sue anyone that performed or helped facilitate an abortion, beginning a litigious bounty program that pits Texans against one another. Other states like Idaho have passed similar laws, with the repeal of Roe v. Wade triggering a law passed by the state's government in 2020, which outlawed abortion except in proven cases of rape, incest, or danger to the mother. That danger is vague and not easily determined, and the rape and incest exceptions must also be accompanied by a police report, or else they're not valid within the state. This has led to most of Idaho's OBGYNs and maternal healthcare providers leaving the state, turning it into a desert for maternal health care. Another one of the many tragic side effects of these types of short-sighted laws. Many other states face similar restrictive laws, imposing felony charges on doctors who perform abortions, even those who would dare to perform abortions on underage girls that were raped by family members. Pregnancies that everyone with a functioning soul would know she should not have to take to term. Sadly, this episode could also be focused on many other women who have experienced similar difficulties in obtaining care during or after a pregnancy, some of whom have experienced permanent life-altering changes to their health or reproductive system. Others, like Amber, have died. ProPublica followed up on the reporting of Amber Thurman's death by sharing the story of 41-year-old Candy Miller, a mother of two who became pregnant and decided to navigate abortion on her own in 2022. Like Amber Thurman, Candy Miller lived in Georgia and was afraid of trying to get her abortion performed at a medical clinic because of the state's laws. Unlike Amber Thurman, though, Candy Miller had pre-existing conditions that made a pregnancy at her age an impossibility. This included diagnoses for lupus, diabetes, and hypertension. So she ordered abortion pills online and took them at her home, slowly languishing until she was found dead in her own bed, laying next to her 3-year-old daughter. Like Amber Thurman, Candy Miller had feared the prospect of seeking help at a hospital in Georgia, but she had suffered the same fate, failing to expel all of the fetal tissue in her system, and she would have required a D&C to save her life, but it's unknown if she would have received it because she had taken the abortion pills. Then there's the story of Josely Barnica, a 28-year-old mother from Texas who was pregnant with her second child in 2021. This was a pregnancy she wanted to keep, as she and her husband were excited at the prospect of growing their family. But at just 17 weeks, the head of the fetus began pressing against her cervix, signaling a miscarriage. She had gone to the hospital, but doctors had to wait until there was no heartbeat before they could help her, by either speeding up the delivery or emptying her uterus. For over 40 hours, she had to suffer as her uterus remained exposed to bacteria. 3 days after delivering her stillborn baby, Josely Barnica died of an infection. In an article published by the Associated Press back in August of 2024, it reported that over 100 pregnant women who had sought help from emergency rooms throughout America had been turned away or negligently treated since 2022, the same year that Roe v. Wade was overturned. In that article, they gave several specific examples, ranging from women who had suffered from ectopic pregnancies or miscarriages, who were left to essentially fend for themselves after seeking care in emergency rooms. That article also highlighted how the new regressive policies enacted by many red states have not only led to the closure of maternal health clinics and a mass exodus of OBGYNs, making them void of much-needed healthcare for pregnant women, but how the states without those regressive policies are now destinations. As a result, they are slowly but surely getting overwhelmed, unable to keep up with the flow of women from out of state seeking not only preventative care but maternal care. This is not just women that are seeking abortions, for the record. This includes women that need simple doctor's appointments to check in on the health of their baby, highlighting how these heartbeat bills, quote-unquote, are doing absolutely fucking nothing to ensure the health of unborn babies. In fact, evidence is showing that they're having the opposite effect. As stated by Dara Cass, an emergency medicine doctor and former U.S. Health and Human Services official who was quoted in the AP article, it is increasingly less safe to be pregnant and seeking emergency care in an emergency department. Before being wheeled back to surgery on August 19, 2022, Amber Thurman had asked her mother to do one thing for her. Promise me you'll take care of my son. Despite all of the hand-wringing from those who seek to protect unborn children, outlawing abortion does nothing but put women like Amber Thurman in jeopardy, and by extension, their own children. At the time of her death, Amber Thurman was a healthy, vibrant 28-year-old single mother, whose 6-year-old son was left without a mother following Amber's preventable loss. There are so many things that I want to say right now, including a number of expletives, but I also know that it's not my place as a man to make this conversation about myself. So as we begin to wind down this episode, I would like to hand things over for a few minutes to a woman, one that you're likely all familiar with.
So let me take a minute to help folks, especially the men in our lives, to get a better sense of what could happen if we keep dismantling parts of our reproductive care system piece by piece, as Trump intends to do. I want folks to understand the chilling effect, not just on critical abortion care, but on the entirety of women's health. All of it. There are good reasons why so many women and physicians are horrified by what's happened since Donald Trump's justices overturned Roe v. Wade. We're seeing women scrambling across state lines to get the care they need. Just this week, a major medical journal reported that after Roe was overturned, infant mortality in this country rose, in large part because women are being forced to carry fetuses that won't survive to term. One woman spent 22 days in jail on murder charges after she miscarried in her own bathroom. We are seeing doctors unsure if they can treat ectopic pregnancies. Doctors being told they can't treat a woman until she becomes so close to death that only a life of the mother exception will allow them to act. So just imagine the profound effects for all of us if Donald Trump wins this election. In states that are already putting abortion bans into effect, his FDA could further outlaw patchwork systems of telehealth appointments and mail-order pills, thereby eliminating the last remaining protections for women in those states. He could take actions that effectively ban abortion nationwide, which would put all of us in danger, no matter what state we live in. We will see more doctors hesitating or shying away from providing life-saving treatments because they are worried about being arrested. More medical students reconsidering even pursuing women's health at all. More OB/GYN clinics without enough doctors to meet demand, closing their doors, leaving untold numbers of women in communities throughout this country without a place to go for basic gynecological care, which in turn will leave millions of us at risk of undiagnosed medical issues like cervical and uterine cancers. This is real. So do you think Donald Trump is thinking about the consequences for the millions of women who will be living in medical deserts? Does anyone think he has the emotional maturity and foresight to come up with a plan to protect us? Yo, we are teetering on the edge. Even before these state bans, America was already lagging behind every other wealthy nation on measures like maternal mortality and paid leave. So we could be right back to the days before Roe, which many young people here don't even remember. The days when abortion wasn't as safe as it is today. The days when the number of mothers of color dying in childbirth was 30 to 40% higher than when it was under Roe. So to the men who love us, let me just try to paint a picture of what it will feel like if America, the wealthiest nation on earth, keeps revoking basic care from its women, and how it will affect every single woman in your life. Your girlfriend could be the one in legal jeopardy if she needs a pill from out of state or overseas, or if she has to travel across state lines because the local clinic closed up. Your wife or mother could be the ones at higher risk of dying from undiagnosed cervical cancer because they have no access to regular gynecological care. Your daughter could be the one too terrified to call the doctor if she's bleeding during an unexpected pregnancy. Your niece could be the one miscarrying in her bathtub after the hospital turned her away. And this will not just affect women, it will affect you and your sons. The devastating consequences of teen pregnancy won't just be borne by young girls, but also by the young men who are the fathers. They too will have their dreams of going to college, their entire futures totally upended by an unwanted pregnancy. If you and your partner are expecting a child, you will be right by her side at the checkups, terrified if her blood pressure is too high, or if there's an issue with the placenta, or if the ultrasound shows that the embryo was implanted in the wrong place, and the doctors aren't sure that they can intervene to keep the woman you love safe. If your wife is shivering and bleeding on the operating room table during a routine delivery gone bad, her pressure dropping as she loses more and more blood, or some unforeseen infection spreads and her doctors aren't sure if they can act, you will be the one praying that it's not too late. You will be the one pleading for somebody, anybody, to do something. And then there is the tragic but very real possibility that in the worst case scenario, you just might be the one holding flowers at the funeral. You might be the one left to raise your children alone. See, these are just some of the ways women die during childbirth. And I don't want to be a downer, y'all. But in many cases, there is no warning, and things go bad very quickly. And when it happens, every second of hesitation or delay can lead to devastating outcomes. So I am asking y'all from the core of my being to take our lives seriously. Please, do not put our lives in the hands of politicians, mostly men, who have no clue or do not care about what we as women are going through, who don't fully grasp the broad-reaching health implications that their misguided policies will have on our health outcomes. The only people who have standing to make these decisions are women with the advice of their doctors. We are the ones with the knowledge and experience to know what we need.
As we close out this episode, I would like to remind all of you that you can have an impact on the world around you. You can speak up, you can do something. You can become or remain an advocate for women, even if you're not one yourself. And, maybe even more importantly, if you live in America, you can vote. Before some of you start to groan and mumble about your vote not mattering, I would just like to remind you about one thing. If your vote did not matter, the powers that be would not be trying so fucking hard to convince you it didn't. Or at least, they would not be trying to steal that constitutional right from you. So if you support women and their access to healthcare, not just abortion access or contraceptives, but simple healthcare, prove it. Go out and vote like their lives depend on it, because as this episode has tried to highlight, they do. Until this nation stops valuing hypothetical children more than living women, then Amber Thurman's story, and countless others just like it, will remain unresolved.